Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second event in the BVALIS series. This is part of the Liz and Bob Frankel Hiking and Environment Spring Lecture Series, co-sponsored by the Mary's Peak Group of the Sierra Club, as well as the Corvallis-Benton County Public Library. Tonight's event is Opportunities for a New Beaver-Human Relationship. My name is Bonnie Brzozowski. I'm a public services librarian at the Corvallis-Benton County Public Library. And before we get started, I would just like to take a moment to orient you to the platform we're using tonight, which is GoToWebinar. And really the only important thing for you to know about it is that there is a bubble with a question mark to the right of your screen. And if you click on it, you can submit any questions or comments you have throughout the presentation. Once we've heard from all of the presenters tonight, we're going to have time to go through the questions received. So the question and answer will be at the end, but please feel free to just be submitting your questions throughout the presentation. The library is so grateful to Dave and the Mary's Peak Group for bringing this amazing series to the community, and we're really proud to be a part of it. So Dave Eckert from the Mary's Peak Group of the Sierra Club is going to tell us more about the series, our panelists, and all of that. So Dave, may I invite you on screen? There you are. Great, thank you. And Dave, you are muted.
Yep, okay. Yeah, okay. Are we recording right now?
We are.
Okay, good. Okay, if you can share my screen. I see Jacob's screen actually on mine. Okay.
My apologies,
Great.
there we go.
Okay, great. And let me start this from the beginning. All righty. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Dave Eckert. I'm with the Mary's Peak Group of the Sierra Club, the program chair, and really excited about this second in a series of 3 BVALIS Oregon webinars. And we had a great time last time, and we'll continue that. This is a beaver dam in Corvallis that you're looking at on Lamprey Creek. This is really part of an annual series, an annual hiking and environmental spring lecture series we've been holding for quite a while, and it's dedicated to the lives and work of Liz and Bob Frankel, who were the preeminent environmentalists in Corvallis on from action on the ground to legislative action. And we are so grateful for all of their work. We are living, if you're in the Benton County Corvallis area, we are living in Champonefu. It's the land of the Amponefu Kalapuya since time immemorial. And the Kalapuya are alive. They are a live culture. And it's very important that we not only acknowledge, but we work very closely with Kalapuya that are at the Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. The Mary's Peak Group inspires a culture engaged with flora and fauna, soil and water, and geological features, and engages people in all of these cultures. So our first webinar was on March 31st. And we had a wonderful time. The title was Local Beavers, How They Live and How We Live With Them. This is in the Benton County Corvallis area. We had 3 excellent speakers talking about how beavers function and where they are, how Corvallis and how Benton County work with them now, and how that has been changing over the last 10 years dramatically, almost radically, and we're very grateful for that. It will be recorded on YouTube very shortly by the Corvallis Library, and you'll be able to find that on their YouTube channel. Our next one after this one, our number 3 is on May 19th, and I hope you sign up for that, about the global and local benefits of protecting beavers, with 3 real hotshots in the field of beaverdom: Suzanne Fouty, Chris Jordan, and Emily Fairfax. These are 3 people you see regularly on the media nationally related to beavers and very specifically to the field that you can see up above. So very excited about having them. I also wanted to alert you to just a 9-minute video that's on YouTube that features this beaver complex where we had in the first slide, and you can see on this slide. And it talks about the difference, a little bit about the difference between human dams and beaver dams, and it does it very locally in Corvallis, and showing the difference between a human dam and a beaver dam. And it's called, of all things, Dammed Oak Creek, D-A-M-M-E-D. If you go on YouTube and just search Dammed Oak Creek, it'll come right up. And it's only 9 minutes, and it's very important for anybody in this area to see that. And I also want to mention our t-shirt, our new Beavallis Oregon t-shirt. We have a few left. They flew off the shelves, or swam off the shelves, I should say. They're not, you can't just go somewhere and get it, and there's not even a website. You have to go to my email address and tell me you want one. We'll tell you how you can get one. So deeckert@willamettewatershed.com. And you can see that below at the bottom of the shirt. Tonight is our second webinar, and we have 4 wonderful speakers. I'm very excited to introduce to you. And the theme tonight is opportunities for a new beaver-human relationship. The first speaker, I'm going to introduce all the speakers now, and and then they're just going to be speaking after that. So listen up for who they are. The first speaker is Jacob Shockey. And I've heard about him for a long time, but this is the first time I've met him. And he is giving a talk, Helping Beavers and Humans Coexist. And Jacob is a professional wildlife ecologist, land steward, and business owner. He is executive director and co-founder of the Beaver Coalition, and he is owner of a company called Beaver State Wildlife Solutions. For those who have read the most popular beaver book in the world, Eager, you'll recognize the name of Michael Callahan out of Massachusetts, the owner of Beaver Solutions, who said, Jacob Shockey is a leading authority on managing beaver-related flooding problems with flow devices in the entire state of Oregon. The Beaver State is in good hands. And he has worked to save beaver in Benton County by helping landowners find ways to find common ground and common water. And when Jacob talks tonight, I think it's very important you're listening very closely. And let me see if I can get the next thing. Okay, just froze, there we go. Our second speaker is Kathleen Wesley, a good friend of mine who I've worked with for about 10 years. And Kathleen is giving a talk called Partnering with Beavers in Oak Creek. And those in Corvallis know the Oak Creek that's in Corvallis. Kathleen has worked with the Marys River Watershed Council for over 10 years, its education programming and restoration programming department. And she has been the lead for the Oak Creek Stakeholder Project. And Kathleen will correct me because I know I got that name wrong. But it's a group that I was privileged to work with Kathleen on finding ways to improve the health of Oak Creek through a coalition. And I hope Kathleen will talk about that. She's also been instrumental in developing beaver habitats and creeks throughout Benton County, and also habitats for cutthroat trout and Pacific lamprey, and you name the aquatic species, she's done it. So thank you, Kathleen. Look forward to your talk. And my computer keeps freezing, like I tell it. There we go. John Milgren. I just met John, and John is, and we're really deeply honored to also have John on tonight. And he's talking about Oregon legislative bills to protect beaver. And John is general counsel at the Western Environmental Law Center. His docket includes legal advocacy to protect Western predators, including wolves, wolverines, lynx, and beaver. Believe it or not, beavers are called predators, as well as preserving Western forests. Prior to working at the center, John worked for Earth Justice and Our Children's Trust. He also teaches environmental law at the University of Oregon Law School, and he has been working on Oregon legislation to protect beaver, about which he will talk tonight. And really looking forward to that. We're honored to have you, John. And our final speaker for the evening is a good friend, Randy Comalillo. And he's talking also about a different Oregon legislative bill that he's put forward to promote alternatives to beaver killing. And Randy is a professional ecologist, and he is Benton County's #1 advocate for, he and his wife, I should say, Pam, are both the #1 advocates for protecting Benton County's wild animals, especially the American beaver. He and his wife, Pam, co-founded the Benton County government's Wildlife and Agricultural Protection Program and continues to advise that program. He has been working on this legislation to protect the beaver with one of our legislators. Now, Randy and Pam also were instrumental in setting up this program, this whole webinar. As soon as I got permission from the Mary's Peak group to do this webinar, I immediately called Randy and Pam and said, this is a subject we have to do. I know nothing about it, and you do. Please help us. Who can we have? What are the subjects? And he and we really owe it to Randy and Pam for that. So thank you, and look forward to your talk. So take it away, Jacob. I'm done. It's all you now.
All right, thank you, Dave. Apologies for the slideshow here. You'll see a little bit of context around it, but this is how we got it to show. So I'll jump in here. I appreciate the invitation. As today, I will be walking through the nitty-gritty around beaver and the urban built environment. I'm going to assume that most of you know a little bit about beaver and what they do and why they do it. And from there, we're going to get into some of the details around what that looks like on the landscape when beaver get themselves in trouble with things that beaver build. So I'll give you a little bit of an introduction, and then we'll get into the toolkit for coexisting, and then I'll give you a bit of my takeaways after working in this world for a number of years. All right. So an introduction, I trained as a wildlife biologist. I pretty quickly found myself in salmon habitat restoration work, as many do on the Pacific Northwest. And I came to beaver from that lens. I was spending a lot of public dollars trying to create habitat for fish, and couldn't help but notice that beaver were doing it better and for free. But that habitat that they created, which I was jealous of, I would have loved to have claimed responsibility for creating some of the beautiful wetlands I saw cropping up, was often then drained because of some sort of altercation that the beaver then had with the built environment around it. So I went back to Massachusetts. I trained with Mike Callahan on some of the coexistence solutions that have been developed on the East Coast, and I brought those back to Oregon in 2015. Since that time, I've been working to help folks around the state with non-lethal and long-term solutions to beaver problems that they're experiencing. And my motivation really is grounded in the wetlands that beavers can create. this is one nearby to where I live, and you could give me a lot of big diesel powered equipment as a restoration practitioner and $500,000, and I can't build this. And this was a cattle pasture, and an absentee landowner owned it for a while. The stream had been diked and moved over to the edge of this cattle pasture, and without folks keeping the water at bay, beaver let the water back into this It's now a 7-acre wetland. So it both represents the beauty that beavers can create, but it's also a bit of a cautionary tale on, when we've developed the floodplains that used to look like this into places with human infrastructure. We just need to bear that in mind. So I've been helping a lot of folks in exactly that situation. This is a business complex that was built at the same level as a wetland, and there's a whole suite of flow devices that one can build instead of trapping out the beaver, which we'll get into. And I'll just generally call this the toolkit. In order to think about the toolkit, think first about the two things that beavers do that upset humans. The first would be tree cutting and killing, and then the second is flooding things. So let's take tree mortality. Beaver will both cut trees down, as this beautiful example. This one's actually in Corvallis, and they're doing that. They use the material, of course, sometimes for their den, lodge, or dams, but often they're doing that to access the cambium on the upper branches and sometimes the trunk as well. Sorry about that. They also flood trees, and that's important to remember as well. So trees die two ways because of beaver. They either get drowned and flooded out, and then you end up with these snag gardens and wetlands, or they can be chewed down. So chewed down is an easy problem to fix. I've helped a lot of folks. Just putting welded wire around a tree is very effective, and you just want to make sure that you leave the tree room to grow. You don't want to use chicken wire because it's really flexible and beaver can put their paws on that and just squash it down. Remember, these animals can be 60 pounds sometimes. This one that I'm putting in here, I reinforced with T-posts, kind of with that in mind. Another version that's pretty effective as well, you can mix latex paint and clean dry sand together. I use a paddle mixer on a drill. And you're basically trying to embed as much sand as possible into the paint. You paint that on the tree. The beavers bite into that. They feel the grittiness on their teeth starting to wear out their teeth. They don't like it, and they'll leave the trees alone too. So those are kind of the tried and true methods for protecting trees that work really well across the landscape. Sometimes you have a crop like the vineyard in the background here. You can see the dead vines a little bit poking out from behind the tree protection label. This was a bunch of Pinot Gris that was being eaten down by beaver. And so you're not going to go in and paint every single one of these grapevines, nor really could you, because the paint only works on trees that are thick enough that it takes a couple bites to get through, but these, it's 1 or 2 bites the beaver are already through, so the sand probably wouldn't keep them from eating it. But an electric fence works really well. So we put up an electric fence to help this Century Farm avoid any more loss to their grapes, and they haven't had anything taken since. Very cheap, very effective. The one caveat there, of course, is that you need to make sure that you maintain the grass around it during fire season, because it is a bit of a fire risk if a bunch of dry grass were to grow up through that. Put it on a solar panel. All the materials are readily available at a local Grange Co-op or Wilco supply store, and away you go. So then, of course, the other thing that beavers do is they reconnect floodplains, and we often have roads and culverts and houses and businesses in floodplains. And so that's what I spend a lot of my time working with folks around. They can also reconnect floodplains in croplands. This was a fescue field near Beaverton, and one small plugged culvert flooded about 3 acres of fescue crop. And so the crop was drowning. The farmer was going to lose that land to production. And so it's not always just infrastructure, but land use that can be ag too, be pretty adversely affected when beavers decide to add more water to the landscape. So we've got these tools to modify the habitat the beaver are creating. And I I don't want to oversell you this as a rosy picture. It is in that we don't have to kill the beaver, and it is in that the beaver can stay and continue to create the habitat that I'm sure you've heard about in previous presentations and the earlier event. But we are modifying the habitat. We are saying that there's a do not exceed line on the amount of floodplain reconnection that beavers can do. And that's functionally what these devices do. So the first of this suite of devices is called a pond leveler. The pond leveler is probably the tool that I use the most. Here's a little schematic of it. And basically this functions like the drain in your bathtub, where you get to a certain point and it's not going to overflow anymore. It's leaking water out no matter if you want it to or not. Beaver will look for a leak at their dam, but they won't think to look way back in their pond. And so what we're doing here is we're functionally hiding the leak back in the beaver's pond where they won't think to look at it. We're surrounding it in a cage such that they never can swim close enough to sense that there's a leak there. And then we're setting the height, the do not exceed line of the impoundment behind the beaver dam, simply by where we put that culvert over the existing beaver dam. So the beaver dam, it has natural porosity, so it's moving water through it and over it as it naturally would, except for at the very top crest, you've got this pipe. And so as beaver try to rebuild the dam up higher, this system kind of usurps that and starts moving water through. And so the beaver won't build off into dry air. They usually leave the dam then at that set height, and this can last really well for many years on end. Another version is culvert protection, and here you can see we're staking, well, they have a cable running down into the culvert. That beaver was damming halfway in a culvert, which is this small 4-foot culvert that goes under Highway 26. Pretty major road and a very small culvert. And when that thing got completely plugged, then they would have to send scuba teams in. It was really quite dangerous to access. So we built a fake beaver dam, if you will, our best impression of a beaver dam in an arch outside the culvert here. And we tried to entice the beavers that that was a better place to dam too. And when we successfully did that, oops, it went back on me again, sorry about that. Here's the schematic kind of that idea, basically removing the damming material away from the entrance of the culvert. In this case, we didn't use wire because it was a stream with many fish in it, but we built our shoddy impression of the beaver dam. It took a little bit to get the beaver to accept it, but eventually they adopted that as their dam. And then we put a pond leveler in, and so the beavers still have their wetland. There's a reinforced beaver dam just on the other side of the culvert now, and the water can flow through clearly. So there's a couple different strategies for protecting culverts, and they take advantage of what we know about the beaver's biology. The other one is the trapezoidal culvert fence, and that one, you build a trapezoid out from the culvert itself on the upstream side. It only works if there's deep water all around, and beaver will start damming where they hear the trickling water next to the culvert. And as they dam that area, they start moving away from that queue, and they start moving along the wings of that trapezoid. And eventually they move out to the point where they're in still water. That flow isn't enough to trigger damming. So you'll often end up with a foot or two of damming on either side of this trapezoid, and then the entirety of the device is still free to allow water to flow through. We've also got tools like dam breaching. This is what a lot of folks go to right off the bat, just to lower the level until there's a longer term solution. And you can also kind of play with where you want beaver to focus their energy by planting willow. Beaver really follow willow planting, and so it's actually a very strong tool in the toolkit. Simply willow staking an area can really increase the beaver focus there, and sometimes help draw them away from other areas. Another tool, of course, is low-tech process-based restoration. And I would imagine Kathleen might get into some of those ideas there, but that's another thing that I've helped folks with. So often I get called out to folks that are struggling with beaver, but there are those who want to see more beaver presence on their land too, and this is a really powerful tool to helping beaver move into an area where the incision is so deep and the velocity is so fast that beaver can't actually have a dam persist without local intervention. The final tool, of course, is relocation. You can move beavers places. The tricky thing with this, of course, beavers mate for life and they're highly territorial. So you have to manage to capture the whole family, and then you have to move them to a place where you don't have another family already occupying the spot, but a place that's good beaver habitat. Those spots can be kind of hard to find sometimes. So it's a bit of a rigmarole. I try not to do as much relocation as possible. It's also a little bit stressful on the animal. And I guess most importantly, if you're moving beaver from a site where they're causing issues, you can bet that another set of beaver will be there in the near term. Sometimes it's like 3 weeks later, sometimes it's the next year, but if it's good beaver habitat, beaver will be back. So this is kind of a temporary reprieve solution at best, but fun to be able to sometimes seed animals in a place that they've been extirpated for many, many years. So that's the toolkit. And I've trotted around our state now since 2015, helping folks with beaver issues. And really, it often comes down to we built infrastructure or houses or crops on the banks of a stream that used to not look like that. You know, the stream that we see is the babbling brook, this single channel of water moving through the landscape, and then everything else is flat around that. Prior to beaver trapping on scale and prior to the land use changes that have happened over the last 200 years, would have looked a lot different, and that water would have been up on the flat surface, contributing to the reason that it's flat. And when beaver come back into an area, they bring that with them. That is the thing that the biologists get really excited about, right? They bring that habitat out and out of these trenches. The problem with that, of course, oh, we did that thing again. With me, there we go. Is that we have often then not left enough space for the beavers themselves to expand that habitat. So I would say that one of the two biggest things that I can suggest in the context of beaver and urban streams, so that you're not in the space that I spend most of my time in of reactively trying to address a problem so that we can be good neighbors, in a limited context, is to consider beaver early. I like to think about beaver as just as important if you're considering developing an area as the rainfall pattern is to the impervious surfaces and how the stormwater system works. You know, we're good about thinking about those things, but we don't consider beaver. And one of the things that I see often, and I've got a little example of that here, is that folks in urban planning situations are promoting development in a certain area. It's flat land. There's a channelized creek moving through. Maybe it's been an ag pasture for a long time. This was a hayfield, and there was a single channel stream moving through it. And the city of Camas needed to locate a pump station, and they also designated the side of the screen with more of the trees as a wetland. That's all on the same gradient. And so as they designated that one spot as wetland, and they did some wetland restoration where they planted a bunch of beaver's favorite foods, beaver moved back into that area. And they took the stream that was 3 feet down in a trench, as it had been maintained by the farmers who had been there for a number of generations. And they quickly brought that stream up and moved it back out on the landscape, and you can see the cascade of habitat that resulted from that. What also resulted was that a many million-dollar pump facility is now completely flooded almost constantly, as is the neighboring property that was still a hayfield until a bunch of water started moving out onto it, and the understandably the fellow who's been haying it is really upset with the city. This is a $15 million problem that resulted from not considering beaver in that initial conception of a project stage. And so I think what I would advocate most strongly from my experience is to think about beaver very seriously whenever you're considering increasing a riparian buffer, planting native plants, or developing in a big flat area that looks super fertile next to a stream, because that's often where I see things get into trouble. This one's difficult to solve with our little toolkit of pond levelers as well, because of course there's very little gradient, so we don't have a lot of wiggle room to work with. Here's another example of what I see often in urban streams. These are stormwater retention ponds. They're often built in conjunction with development, and basically what happens is a bunch of the stormwater that comes off of the subdivision enters into the stormwater pond and then slowly moves out into the creek system. It's kind of like a battery, if you will, that's supposed to dampen down the severity of the flooding that enters into the creek all at once from the stormwater system. So this is like a speed bump, if you will. So it swells up with water and then it releases the water out into the system. This one, as you can see, grew a bunch of willows, and so beavers moved in and started using it as a pond too. Folks often don't anticipate this, but this happens a lot. And then what beaver do is they plug the orifice that leaks his water out into the stream, and pretty quickly you have a pond that's completely full and full of wildlife, but no longer functions as it was designed to act like that buffer. And so I would suggest that the important thing to think about here is both early consideration when designing projects like subdivisions. And I know many of you are not in the urban planning world, but that really would solve a lot of the conflicts that we are experiencing. And then the other piece is just to give the stream space. We've all gotten used to a stream that has a little strip of forest on either side of it. We call that the riparian forest. And biologists like me went to school and saw lots of diagrams where each one of those zones of the riparian forest is carefully designated by its proximity to the water, and we talk about which plants grow there. And that's very oversimplistic. Riparian areas used to be threaded channels, like a braid, if you will, of channels, channels that were maintained by beaver, but also the dams and deeper pools that are excavated by beaver. And the important thing for us when we're living close to that wildness and close to those wetlands is to simply give them space. This is the parking lot that I've been trying to help the landowner with. And again, the situation was that way back before any of us that are now involved in this situation, somebody wanted to develop a piece of land that was flat next to a creek, and it was designated a wetland. So they donated part of their land to be the mitigation wetland, and then they developed the rest of the creek, or the rest of what would have been the wetland, but then became a parking lot. And as you can see, over time, the parking lot has subsided and beaver have reconnected the wetland. And so you have an untenable situation here where you have infrastructure at the same elevation as a wetland, and you have wetlands that's been designated as a wetland by people, and you have a parking lot that's been created by people, and people also put those on the same elevation. And so this idea of space, if we're going to be serious about the benefits that beaver provide to urban streams, that requires relinquishing space. Here's a spot in Salem where there was no space given. So the folks in the background there are on the edge of a very steep incised urban stream, and there's beaver activity in there. But it's probably 15 feet down before you hit the water. And this is a beaver trying to basically cut the corner and build a canal out into the landscape to forage safely. And they came up under this parking lot, and as you can see, it caved in on their tunnel. Beaver are not like nutria; they are not prolific tunnelers. Usually, they have just their little den in the bank, or maybe a freestanding lodge if they're in a wide floodplain. But they do build canals out into the landscape to safely forage back and forth. And when they hit asphalt, they go under it. So their canals, which are usually open to the sky, then become these tunnels. And I've seen a number of these, again, space. And if we don't have space, we, as humans, are really good about ending up in situations where we just keep doing the same thing over and over again. This is a spot where they were trying to keep the beaver dam down. And so you can see they've been notching it in 2 spots every single day for over a year. And those mounds are where they've stuck all the debris that the beaver put back in place the next night. And so I think with early consideration in space, we can be a lot closer to the water quality and the flood mitigation effects the beaver offer our urban streams. We can also get away from repetitive stuff like this. These people were out there every day doing this, and they still are. We haven't actually addressed it yet. So trying to get off these treadmills. Often what people go to first is trapping, and of course trapping is very effective at getting the offending family of beaver out of that area. But it doesn't matter if it's lethal trapping or relocation, you're just opening up that habitat for a new colony to move in. And so it's a very temporary fix, as of course is this. So looking at that, beaver dams can offer us a lot in an urban context. They are shown to be highly effective at cleaning water, and a lot of our urban streams are suffering from water quality. And they're also very effective at attenuating flood. So when we get a big pulse of water, and especially if we've developed the landscape and we have a lot of impervious surface all across the landscape, that can be a really big shock to a stream system as that all starts to drain out at once. And beaver dams on the landscape, you can see this one is in Salem on a little urban stream, and you can see the pond leveler kind of poking out of there. They provide a bit of a speed bump, and as you have more beaver dams in series, not only are the toxins and the heavy metals settling out behind these dams, but you also attenuate your flood flow. So your hydrograph gets broadened out over a longer period of time, and you don't have the same flooding risks that you do when you have just kind of an open canal. So I would say those would be my thoughts, and I would welcome questions at the end of this. I'm really happy to pass it over now to Kathleen Wesley for her presentation.
Thank you, Jacob. Can you all see that fine?
Looks great.
Great. Well, thank you. That is a lovely segue. I think people are going to chuckle and think that we actually coordinated our talks, but we didn't. So I'm going to be talking specifically today about Oak Creek and about Marys River Watershed Council's work in Oak Creek, and starting with the reason for why the council sort of took a more focused approach, strategic approach to the Oak Creek watershed a few years ago. We'd been working in our model watershed streams, our headwaters coming off of the east flanks of Mary's Peak and elsewhere for a number of years, and had accomplished really a lot of that work to enhance those anchor habitats for our key indicator aquatic species, cutthroat trout. And we realized that the Oak Creek watershed was a next step in a really important watershed in the Marys. And it's rather unique in the Marys in that it has so many changes that it goes through in the types of habitats that are contained in the watershed. At the top in the north, where you see the brown and green, those are forested headwater streams, mostly owned by, in the brown, OSU research forests, and in the green, Starker forests. And then we transition from those higher gradient timbered streams to that middle reach, which is primarily agricultural, rural, residential. And we're fortunate to have some substantial conserved protected lands with the City of Corvallis Bald Hill Natural Area and Greenbelt Land Trust Bald Hill Farm, and then a couple of other smaller parks, the Witham Hill Natural Park and MLK Park, owned or as part of the city's parks. So that middle reach is really about that agricultural, little bit lower gradient. And then we come down into an urban stream where the lower part of Oak Creek flows through the OSU campus. It is part of the stormwater conveyance system for the city. It enters the Marys just across from Avery Park, not far from the confluence with the Willamette. So it really encompasses such a broad range of habitats, and also as a result has a wide range of interests and priorities and diverse representatives of stakeholders, be it landowners, land managers, agencies, or municipalities that have management responsibilities, regulations, and so forth, as well as a number of nonprofits like the Watershed Council. So we decided to apply to OWEB, Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, and were awarded a stakeholder engagement grant to coordinate a collaboration between all of these disparate groups and see where we could identify priority needs in the watershed to really steward and enhance Oak Creek and improve its health and function where we could. And I won't read all of the groups that participated. We had a very broad representation, as you can see. And we met up until COVID started. We were able to meet a couple of times in person and then had to shift, as all the world did, to Zoom and such. But through the course of a couple of years, we were able to really hone in on some key priorities. MRWC, the Marys River Watershed Council, coordinated these efforts, but we were very, very appreciative of all of the participation and the thoughts and ideas that went into identifying some key habitats and also other activities, other priorities for the watershed. And what we came up with, well, number one, we named ourselves, and that is the Oak Creek Watershed Network. And you will be able to find the Oak Creek Watershed Network on the Oregon Explorer. We have a landing page there as part of the community group, and there's information, history. One of the really important, unique things about the watershed is that so much of it is owned by OSU, about 41%. And as a result, OSU has really used Oak Creek as a learning laboratory for decades. And there is has been amassed a great amount of research conducted in the watershed. So that's part of what is available on the Oregon Explorer landing page. But something that Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board requires with any stakeholder engagement project is to really look at where on the ground restoration is needed and can be worked toward. So in addition to our full group meetings in the collaboration, we also had subgroups formed that helped to identify what those key priority habitats were. We decided on two major buckets, if you will, of important habitats. The first, upland systems, oak, woodlands, and savanna, and upland prairies that support things like the Fender's blue butterfly, which is a good deal of that kind of restoration has been going on in Oak Creek and will continue to. But today we're looking at the riparian systems, which is the other focal area. And we looked at the streams and the wetlands and the wet prairies in Oak Creek. And as we're all getting a very good idea, beaver and wetlands and streams have a lot to do with one another. So beaver became a really important part of our focus on that riparian system. And what I'd like to do is kind of give you a little bit of a photo tour, if you will. I'm privileged in my work with the council to be able to go in and see a lot of stream reaches that are privately owned, and one has to have permission to access them. So I've been able, as I say, really feel privileged to be able to see these, and am glad to be able to share them with you. All of these habitats are, most of them anyway, that you'll see today are not available for regular public access. So please don't try to go into some of them. And I also would like to note, anytime that you know that you are in an area where beaver are active, really do keep your dog on a leash. The dogs running off leash can definitely have a disturbing influence or impact on beaver. So because we have active beaver in Oak Creek, and I want to really share that with you throughout the watershed, both the main stem and the tributaries, we have active beaver. They are building dams, creating ponds like you see here. In some cases, series of dams and complexes of multiple ponds. And there are various signs that we can see that I want to introduce you to a little bit if you don't know already. So this is one of the complexes in Oak Creek. And this is a series, again, of a number of dams of different sizes. And you can see here where the trees that have been inundated are dying, if not dead. There's another one. And this is actually part of the Lamprey Creek complex that Dave mentioned earlier. Here's another one that you can see the water in the foreground is actually the channel, and then that swath of vegetation in the middle is the beaver dam, and there's a lot of willow now that's growing, and the dam's been there for long enough that the willow has been established in the dam. And then the water in the background is the level of the pond. It's about a 4.5-foot beaver dam, and therefore a 4.5-foot aggradation between the water levels. And again, another series of dams and ponds there. This is actually a dam. At the time I took this 3 years ago, it was about 5 feet tall, and it's in Main Stem Oak Creek. And that to me was quite remarkable because we do get some pretty high flashy flows in the winter in Oak Creek, and it was obviously a well-established dam. I've seen it again subsequently, and it's still there. It was a little bit lower than this time that I had taken this picture, but it is persisting, and the beaver really, as you can see, have taken advantage of kind of a pinch point in between some higher banks to have a pretty well-established dam. These are some other dams, and they are just typical of the kinds of dams that I see throughout Oak Creek and its tributaries. A little bit smaller. Top left is probably a 3-foot dam. The others are relatively small, but they are numerous throughout the system. Here's some other sign that you might encounter. Top left is a series of, or a cache of willow sticks. Middle upper is a chewed willow that's now growing back. The top right is, as you can see, hopefully there's some kind of bright brown chewed tops of willow that the beaver are managing. Bottom right is a dam entry, and this kind of illustrates why beavers, or excuse me, not a dam entry, a den entry, and illustrates why beaver like to have dams to cover up their dens, their den entrances. In the middle bottom, some peeled sticks that the beaver have removed, the bark and cambium. And then in the bottom left, one of those hourglass chewed trees that they did indeed drop and got after the branches. So those are some of the signs, and again, repeated throughout the system. So why support beavers in their activities in Oak Creek? If they're all throughout the system like they are, and they're doing all their good things, why should we support them, and why should we care? Well, for starters, they're fellow creatures and intrinsically worthy. They also are a keystone species. They provide habitat for other creatures and plants and support a broad diversity of species. And they co-evolved with some species that are now threatened and endangered. They increase stream complexity and floodplain engagement. I know these are some things that you've heard, but good to be reminded, hopefully. They filter water through the soil and plants, which improves water quality. They impound water higher in the system and retain it longer in the year. That reduces flooding downstream. Both of those are human benefits, or benefit the human community as well as the creatures that live there. They recharge the groundwater, keeping the riparian buffers greener and wider, which has implications for wildfire. And I expect in the next Bevallis presentation, we'll hear more about that. And they sequester carbon in the vegetation that they manage. When they chew the willow, and the willow likes that, it grows more stems and sequesters more carbon. So what's the problem? They're doing some work. Why do we specifically need to be concerned about what's going on in Oak Creek? This is a page of the from the Benton County GIS mapping system, and the blue parts are where there are wetlands of significance, wetlands of local significance. The green are wetlands of special significance. So you can see just this is the center part of Oak Creek. Right here we have Walnut Boulevard, Harrison Boulevard. So this is that intersection there with 53rd, Harrison, Walnut, and Oak Creek. And you can see all this area here, just that snapshot of how much wetland area is in that location. And I want to kind of dive in a little closer. We've already talked some about Lamprey Creek, so let's take a closer look at that. You'll see the yellow arrow points to the place on Lamprey Creek where an earthen dam was built years ago. and the creek was moved and ditched over to the west. At the time it was moved, Walnut Boulevard was not there. This is a map that Dave and the Sustainability Coalition put together a few years back. The blue shows the current streams, and the purple dashed line shows the previous. And just like Jacob was talking about, where normal historical floodplain streams had multiple channels, braided channels, that's what Lamprey Creek used to look like. And you can see now how that ditch has become the only channel really of any consequence in the system as it comes out of that lower part of Lamprey and across Harrison into Oak Creek at that point and into Harrison. So this is a picture from 1936. It's an aerial that was taken in 1936. And again, that yellow arrow points to where that earthen dam was built. And already that stream had been moved over. And as I said, Walnut wasn't there at the time, but it was moved over so as to keep the water off of the field and allow that field to be planted and farmed. And so already we were altering the system. Now let's take a look at what a case study, if you will, of what the beaver are doing with that ditch. And thank you, Bob Beshta. I think he rightly named it Lamprey Ditch because it really isn't the stream. The stream was over to the east in that wider riparian area. But the beaver are taking it from that upper right. You can see a single thread incised channel. It's very narrow, very deep. And with their damming and ponding activities, they've widened that floodplain to encompass the low terraces on either side of the channel. This is a photograph that you've seen at the top left, Mike Mealy Brown's photo of the dam at the dike and the pond behind it. The beaver really took advantage again of that pinch point between the earthen dike and the narrow channel that was the ditch to shunt the stream over to the west, and built about a 6-foot substantial, quite wide dam. And this picture in the bottom right is actually was just taken recently. The dam has a small breach in it that the beaver are not actively working on right now. I anticipate that they will do that as the flows come down later in the year or as we move into summer, because again, they do like to keep those water levels up to cover their den entrances and give themselves plenty of room to swim in, where they're very agile and safe as compared to being on the land. This is the east and main channel above the dam, and that channel actually goes all the way up into the Skyline West neighborhood. It is kind of where those headwaters are, and flows through MLK Park, and then Walnut crosses it, and it comes down there on the east side and into that pond area where the earthen dike was built, and then is where it's shunted off more to the west. And this next one is an impoundment on the west side, where there's a smaller side channel that the beaver have really been creating, as Brian Banks called it last time, a mess with all the trees that they're felling there, and really doing the work, as Jacob was pointing out earlier, when we have left it to the beavers, they've done their good work and created that habitat on their own. So how do we support beavers when they're able to do so much on their own? Sometimes the hydrology in systems where decades and decades ago we logged out all of the conifer and the riparian, and so that conifer component is no longer dropping into the stream. That changes the hydrology, and there is no longer large wood to support beaver dam activities. So we can add wood, we can leave wood. As you can see in that bottom right, those are legacy logs that have been left in the main channel. The upper left is a beaver dam analog that was installed actually in the Upper Marys this summer. That one was done using equipment because we had equipment there, but you can certainly also do the low-tech hand-installed post rows like Jacob showed. And then in the upper right, planting willow, planting construction materials for dam building like ash trees and cottonwoods. And then we can advocate for wise zoning and including the space that beaver need, that wetlands need, that riparian floodplains need to really be able to provide all the habitat, keep the flooding downstream to a minimum, all those wonderful things that they provide if we're not continually impinging upon them with roadways and crossing and structures. I also wanted just to briefly mention the council is one of 5 watershed councils that's part of the Mid-Willamette Beaver Partnership. All of the 5 watershed councils that are here in the Mid-Valley. We also have the Bonneville Environmental Foundation and staff representatives from the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians that are part of this partnership. We'll be sharing more about that, but essentially we are looking both to model and verify with on-the-ground checks all of the watersheds for high priority beaver centric restoration opportunities, as well as engaging with stakeholders to really understand attitudes about beaver and how we can be sensitive to where conflicts might arise, and then helping folks to manage those conflicts with some of the tools that Jacob described. But again, also really trying to think ahead and avoid those conflicts from the beginning. And lastly, there are just some resource links. I did want to give a shout out to Shay Steingass, who gave us the Leave It to Beavers name that we have adopted for the Mid-Willamette Beaver Partnership. And we presently have that web page or website linking to the Lucky Mute Watershed Council, but it will be its own standalone website soon. And then, of course, just to recommend that you do visit the Oak Creek Watershed Network on the Oregon Explorer. Thank you. And with that, I will hand it over to John.
Hi, everyone. My name is John Mellgren, and I am an attorney at the Western Environmental Law Center. I'm based down in Eugene, and I spend my days for the most part, suing the government. As Dave mentioned, I focus on a lot of carnivore work, forest protection work, and for the last few years, I've also been working on beaver work here in the Beaver State. And so I'm really pleased to be here today, and I'll be talking about some recent legislative action that we have seen over the past couple of years pop up, that some of which was exciting, and some of it is going to be remain to be seen how it works on the ground, and some of it was disappointing based on how it ended up. So let's dive right in. So you might be surprised to learn that in Oregon, beavers are classified as a predator. And so to get to this point, I just want to kind of walk through generally how wildlife are managed real quick. It's generally in the state of Oregon unlawful to take a beaver in violation of the laws of the state. Well, that makes sense. That the same is true for just about all wildlife. And the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife is governed by the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission, which is has appointed members. The governor gets to appoint them. Currently, they're designated by congressional district, and the commission promulgates rules which have the force of law governing how wildlife are managed. And so the commission has listed beaver as a fur bearer or fur-bearing mammal. And you can only take a beaver with specific methods in a particular season and in specific locations. And every couple of years, the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission sets a new rule for where all fur bearers can be taken, what the seasons are, how many you can take, if a limit, if there's any locations you have to be excluded from, etc. However, it gets a little more complicated than that. The legislature has an old law that says that nothing in the wildlife laws is intended to prevent any person from taking any wildlife that is causing damage, is a public nuisance, or poses a public health risk on land the person owns or lawfully occupies. And then additionally, the legislature has prevented the Fish and Wildlife Commission from prescribing limitations on the times, places, or amounts for the taking of predatory animals. And predatory animals are defined to include rodents. And because the beaver is a rodent, it too is classified as a predatory animal. So this is a long way just to say that, generally the commission can manage all wildlife, and they do that. However, because of this other statute and because of the limitations the legislature has imposed to protect private landowners from the impacts of predatory animals, the commission essentially can only deal with beaver trapping, beaver take generally outside of the public land or private land context, which leaves us with public lands. And Oregon is blessed to have a lot of public lands. About half the state or more is in the public domain. But we have this issue with predatory animal designation for beaver. And so the predatory animal statute continues that if your property is infested with a predatory animal, and as soon as you know they are there, you can immediately begin to control them by poisoning, trapping, or other appropriate and effective means. And importantly, you don't actually have to wait for any damage to be occurring. And as you saw in a number of Jacob's slides, you have a lot of potential for very real and very costly infrastructure damage that people have to deal with. Someone has to pay for that. Someone has to fix it. However, you don't have to have a risk of damage. You don't have to have a actual damage occurring. As soon as you know that there's a beaver there, if you're a private landowner, you can trap it as you see fit to protect your land. There's no need for a permit, and there's no need to report your trapping to the state. And this reporting thing, we're going to come back to it in a little bit, but it's very, very important. Right now, sadly, we just don't have a lot of data on a wide scale landscape level. Where the beaver are, where beaver are being taken. If those beaver takings are occurring in areas where it's particularly important to have beaver, such as in important salmonid habitat, or other places where it's really important to have the benefits from beaver on the landscape. And so as a result, we also can't use that data to make a pitch for further protections for beaver, or to have certain areas that are beaver protection zones, or anything like that. And so that reporting would be really important otherwise, just to know, we can't even say how many beaver are killed in Oregon every year. We don't know. The state of Oregon kind of covers its eyes and just has no way of knowing. And so we have the Fish and Wildlife Commission making these policies on when and where we can trap beavers without actually being able to identify if there's a problem, where there's a problem, or whether or not their regulations are actually rational. But again, that's kind of getting back just to the limited public land side for the commission. But here, so we have this issue with the predatory animal statute. And, when we were first approached at the Western Environmental Law Center to take a look at this statute and figure out what was going on and what can be done about it, we actually went up to the state law library in Salem, where they have boxes and boxes of what's called legislative history, all the documents from the legislature that tells the story of what was going through legislators' minds as they were passing legislation. What were the discussions in committees? What were the floor statements made by members of the legislature? Really just explaining themselves. What's the need for this? What are we thinking? Sometimes there's ambiguity in statute, and the floor statements or committee statements can help clarify what was actually being thought of, so we know what the legislature meant, especially with statutes that were passed a very long time ago. So we went there to check out these predatory animal statutes and the legislative history, and it's true that rodent is listed there, but when you go through the materials at the law library, every single discussion about rodents was mice or rats getting into grain stores, things like that. There was no mention of beaver anywhere. It's possible that beaver was discussed and specifically included, but there's no actual documentation showing that the legislature intended for beaver to also be lumped in with all other rodents in the predatory animal statute. So that's where we were at. And so needed to figure out a way to deal with this issue. From my organization, which is a nonprofit organization, we believed that it's reasonable for the Fish and Wildlife Commission, the agency that's tasked with managing wildlife. We thought that they should be tasked with managing wildlife everywhere in Oregon, not just on public lands, because of this one quirk of the law. We thought the commission could do a good job of figuring some of this out. So we needed to do something about that. And I have the slide on a lot of the damage that can be caused by beavers. Jacob talked a little bit about that, so I won't spend too much time on it here. But again, there's very real damage that can come from beavers. And so you need to have a system that allows for dealing with that damage, especially if you have an emergency situation. If someone's basement is actively getting flooded, or a road is getting washed out and you have someone who needs to get to their dialysis appointment, you need to deal with the issue somehow. And so it's a complicated thing. What do we do here? And so Representative Marsh, who represents portions of Southern Oregon, especially if you think of the area roughly, around Ashland, Talent, parts of Medford, that area. She represents that area of the state, and is still in the legislature now. But she introduced House Bill 2844 in Oregon's session in 2021, so a little over a year ago. And during that session, we tried to address this predatory animal statute. So this bill, I guess I'll spill the punchline now, it did not pass. But if it had, it would have removed beaver from predatory animal status. It would have required the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission to establish a permitting system for beaver take on private lands that prioritizes non-lethal coexistence tools. As Jacob talked about, we have a lot of things we can do to help prevent these conflicts, and that in the long run are much cheaper. There's a lot of research showing that you might have a greater upfront cost, but because as the other presenters talked about, the beavers will return. If a beaver is there, it's a good spot for a beaver, and some other beaver is going to come back. And so it can, over the long run, it can really cut down your costs. So, we wanted to So the hope was that the commission or the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife would have helped address some of these issues in a non-lethal manner. And it really was designed to encourage beaver presence on the landscape. Importantly, it was not a ban on beaver take to deal with property damage. It was just trying to place beaver exclusively under the control of the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission and ODFW, and let them come up with reasonable regulations or a reasonable scheme to deal with these issues. And I have a copy of the bill here up on the screen, or at least the first page of it. And ultimately, it was amended a little bit to deal with some concerns from the agency about how it would have to implement things here. We spent a lot of time talking to the Association of Oregon Counties, the Farm Bureau, some irrigator groups, other agricultural groups, people who say that they need to take beaver in order to have a productive operation. And so there were some amendments to try to deal with some of the issues we were hearing. And ultimately, it was chosen to have a hearing in the House Agriculture Committee, or House Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee. And it got a hearing. We put together a wonderful panel, including a couple of the speakers on the next presentation, Dr. Fairfax and Dr. Jordan, both of whom are so incredibly knowledgeable and so great in their presentations. And very sadly, instead of having the opportunity to present the full panel, Dr. Fairfax got to speak and was given, if I remember right, it was about a minute of time. So you have a professor who, writes lots of papers on this and does, multi-hour presentations on beaver and fire risk, and had to condense it all down into a minute, which sometimes, you can barely get past your introduction in that amount of time. So it was given really short shrift, and sadly, it did not pass out of committee. It wasn't even, at the time, the Oregon Democrats, or they still have control in the House, so they were in the majority, and some of the the Republicans on the committee all voted against it, and some of the Democrats joined the Republican colleagues in opposing the bill moving out of committee and to a vote in the House of Representatives. And so, sadly, the bill died. It didn't move forward, and we weren't able to address the predatory animal situation. Now, at the same time, Rep. Marsh also introduced a really great bill, House Bill 2843. And so, if you remember a couple minutes ago, I was talking about, the difference between with the predatory animal statute, you have this dichotomy between public lands and private lands. And 2843, which was led by a wonderful group of advocates, would have tried to address that issue and create habitat or protect habitat, ensure that beaver have a safe place to go. Especially one of the parts of the other bill, would have talked about relocation, and as Jacob talked about, relocation can be problematic in many situations, especially because you're going to have beaver coming back in. Sometimes if you relocate a beaver, they will find their way back, and then ultimately also you need good beaver habitat to relocate a beaver to, if that's what you're going to do. And so this bill would help deal with that by prohibiting beaver trapping and hunting on federally managed public lands in Oregon. It would have provided that extensive habitat for beaver to do what they do best and help realize the vast benefits from beaver. But very sadly, it didn't even get a hearing. The other bill at least had a few minutes to present its case before the legislature, or before the House Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee. And this bill, unfortunately, did not move forward even to that committee phase, which was really unfortunate. I think the two bills together would have been a huge step forward for beaver in Oregon. And alas, both did not move forward. And so I'm sad to be the downer presenter. It's just the reality of what happened at the legislature. Politics is a very interesting game. The old saying, the two things you don't want to see made, legislation and sausage, and it's so very true. But so that was 2021. In 2022, there was more legislative action on beaver. And there was the Oregon Private Forest Accord, which you may recall hearing a while back. There was an issue where a number of Republican legislators in Oregon walked out, and it prevented the legislature from passing bills, from doing its job. And this was in part related to the timber unity movement in Oregon, and a debate on what to do about climate change and what to do with private forests. And there's a whole host of things going into that. But one of the things that happened as a result of some litigation and the result of some of those dynamics was this agreement, a settlement agreement that was where you had conservation groups and the private timber industry and the government coming together to negotiate this agreement to help deal with the issue of Oregon's intensive industrial scale logging that we have here, especially on private lands in Oregon. And so very surprisingly, they reached an agreement that has a whole lot of components to it. And it would relate exclusively to private timberland Oregon management in Oregon, or it does. I shouldn't talk about it in the past tense. But it resulted in legislation that passed in 2022 to help implement this agreement. And that is also going to result in a habitat conservation plan, which a habitat conservation plan is something that gets submitted to the government for the purposes of getting what's called a Section 10 permit under the Endangered Species Act, which allows non-federal parties to get to basically take a certain amount of endangered species in exchange for conservation benefits to the species. And I should note this: the picture that I have on the screen is actually the cover of the agreement. It was a report submitted to the legislature about this agreement that resulted in this legislation. And I actually had never really looked at the cover of this document before I prepared for this presentation, and was surprised that it had a beaver right on the front, along with the salmon. But anyways, so it's going to result in this habitat conservation plan down the line, but the first step towards implementation was the legislature needed to pass some bills to help them implement it and get the ball rolling on this process. And the groups that were part of the negotiating parties to the agreement included some beaver provisions in it. And I just want to run through a few of those provisions as they're interesting. So, earlier I talked about the reporting piece of this, that reporting is really important. We need to gather data. We need to figure out what's going on, where and how. And so it doesn't fully address the reporting issue in the state of Oregon, but it does require that if beaver is taken on privately owned timberland, the owner of the land needs to report that take to the state, both the reason, the location, and the amount of take. So we can start to gather this data. And private timberland in Oregon represents a good chunk of the state, so it'll help us start to develop data on how much beaver take is actually happening and where is it happening. It also requires the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife to do an annual report on beaver take and provide that to the public. So it's kind of taking those beaver take reports and putting it into a sensible format with data and conclusions that we can draw from that data for public consumption. And it also limits beaver take on private timberland. However, these limitations only apply if you're a large or if you're not. The specific language is if you're not a small timberland, and that's defined as less than 5,000 acres. So basically, any privately owned timberland greater than 5,000 acres in size is going to be subject to these limitations on beaver take on those private timberlands. And so before you can take a beaver, there has to be an identified threat to infrastructure, unlike the predatory animal statute that just lets you see a beaver, you can go ahead and take it because it's going to be assumed to be causing damage. Here you actually have that real legitimate threat to infrastructure. The private landowner must also first ask ODFW to address the infrastructure risk and then wait 30 days before taking beaver themselves. And as part of ODFW's job, when they get the ask to help address the infrastructure risk, ODFW is required to make a reasonable attempt to relocate. And so that's where the importance of the other bill that didn't get a hearing comes in, to having habitat available for beaver to go to. And ODFW needs to do something. It could decide to lethally remove a beaver, but it has to make this reasonable attempt to relocate, and it also could use non-lethal means to help address the infrastructure risk. You know, maybe ODFW helps the landowner get in touch with Jacob and install, you know, something to be a more permanent, long-term solution to the infrastructure risk, you know, whatever it may be. And ODFW also has to develop a voluntary relocation program as part of this to help get landowners interested in doing something aside from lethally removing beaver. Now, I want to say one thing I guess I want to say is, you know, this did happen. I think, you know, it's a positive step overall for beaver in Oregon, but it addresses a slice of the issues that are going on with beaver in Oregon, and it also has some holes. It's not as strong as some would like. You know, I you know, I work for a nonprofit law firm, and I have clients, you know, that kind of run the spectrum in terms of protecting the environment. And some are really excited about this, love it, and think it's an incredibly great step forward. Others are very skeptical and have concerns that this is going to prevent the state from taking additional steps to protect beaver and ensure that we're fully recognizing the importance of beaver in the state of Oregon, you know, which, you know, is on our flag and is, you know, the mascot for Oregon State. So, you know, I don't want to paint this as being an entirely rosy picture. It's certainly a step forward. It will be better for beaver than without it in the state, but you know, there could be more, and certainly dealing with the predatory animal statute is going to be a really important step to help get the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission and the Department of Fish and Wildlife to manage beaver across the entire state and not just on public lands in Oregon. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Randy. Thank you so much for having me, and have a great evening.
Hi, everyone. Before I hand it over to Randy, I just wanted to let everyone know that we are at our end time, 8 o'clock. So if you have to go, we understand. However, I don't want to skip over Randy because he has some important stuff to tell us. So I'm going to have him share his presentation, and we may just not be able to cover the question and answer at the end. I want to remind you that if you do have to go, that's absolutely no problem at all. You will get an email with a link to this video, and you can just fast forward right to the end and see Randy's presentation then. So let me let Randy share his screen with us here, and he'll get us started in just a second. Thank you so much, Randy.
Okay. So thanks, John. As Dave said, I'll be talking about a bill to create a statewide non-lethal wildlife deterrence grant program in Oregon. This was a House bill that was introduced in 2021, which would establish a wildlife conflict species non-lethal deterrence fund to support grant programs throughout the state. We defined a new term called wildlife conflict species, and it includes the list you can see here, which included beavers. But to understand the bill, the best way is just to look at the Benton County Agricultural and Wildlife Protection Program. The bill was designed to emulate this program around all the counties in Oregon. So the Agricultural and Wildlife Protection Program in Benton County was first funded by Benton County taxpayers in 2017. It was designed in collaboration with OSU Extension Service and the Shintimony Wildlife Center. And its purpose was to encourage the proactive use of non-lethal animal damage deterrence in an effort to foster the coexistence of agriculture and wildlife in Benton County. So each biennium, the AWPP funds a $40,000 grant program and grants for up to $5,000 for the purchase of proactive non-lethal wildlife deterrents to protect livestock, property, and crops. And also there's a special $5,000 set-aside fund for beaver deterrence that can be applied for at any time. So the non-lethal wildlife deterrence program prevents conflicts with wildlife before they occur. It also invests in the purchase of long-term protective measures and recognizes the ecological value of local wildlife. It also avoids indiscriminate killing by traps and snares. The program is managed by county officials and a grant review committee with citizen volunteers and representatives from OSU Extension Service and the Shintimity Wildlife Center and the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. It also has a panel of local and international experts. Our expert on beaver-human conflict resolution is Mike Callahan of Beaver Coalition in Massachusetts, or Beaver Institute in Massachusetts. And as we were designing the program, we wanted to understand human-wildlife conflict in the county. So we reviewed U.S. Department of Agriculture wildlife conflict data for Benton County, and we were able to determine the types and amounts of different types of wildlife conflict. And so, for example, we looked at livestock losses over a 10-year period from 2004 to 2014 and found that in Benton County, the predominant issues with livestock were with predation of sheep and fowl, which were the majority of the problem in the county. We also looked at the different types of beaver damage in the county. This was primarily chewing damage to trees, especially hardwoods and fruit and nut trees, and actually a smaller amount of damage to roads and dikes and infrastructure like that. And so based on this information, we decided we would award grants for these types of deterrents for livestock guardian dogs, portable electric fencing, electronic scare devices like box lights, and also protective housing. And for beavers, the kind of devices that we've been talking about tonight, that Jacob talked about, like this beaver pond leveler, also fencing, and sand paint will also, you can also apply for that through the grant program. And so looking at the results of the program, it's been in effect now for 4 years, and we've got applicants and grant recipients scattered all around the county, from the Coast Range to the Valley floor. We have a couple applicants for beaver deterrents, one up near the Polk County border to protect some fruit trees along the Little Lucky River with fencing. And so through the 4 years, we've had no livestock and very little crop or property damage over that period, even though beavers and cougars and coyotes were still present at these locations based on trail cam data. And all grant recipients said they were satisfied with their deterrents and would recommend the program to others. One of the first beaver projects we did was to partner with the Public Works Department in Benton County to install a pond leveler on Denawi Creek near 53rd Street, near the railroad trestle, which sometimes floods. There's a storm drain there, which often gets covered with leaves, but also the beaver are active building dams in this reach. So we decided to talk to Public Works about installing a pond leveler. And so here's Jacob and Chris Jordan floating the pond leveler into place several years ago. And Jacob installing fencing to hold it down. And actually just beyond Jacob there, you can see the previous material used to build the dam. The way the county used to deal with dams that are in bad locations for the Public Works Department was to bring in prison work crews and have them disassemble the dams and throw the material up on the bank. And of course, they would come back and because this was a popular spot for beavers, and rebuild the dam. And so now they're having this pond leveler in place. Public Works is now doesn't have to do that anymore. Here's a couple of views of the pond leveler going through the dam as the beavers were starting to rebuild it again. And so getting back to the House bill to create a statewide deterrence program, my wife and I were meeting with Representative Rayfield in 2021 to discuss another wildlife matter, and we got on the subject of the Benton County grant program. He was very interested in it and took notice of its success and asked us if we would help his staff write a bill to fund non-lethal deterrence grant programs in all the counties in Oregon. So we wrote the bill so that Oregon Department of Agriculture would manage the funds for the program. We met with representatives from ODA and they helped us design the bill, how it would operate. We decided the best way was to have the grant programs operated at the county level, just like the Benton County program. All that was required for a county to be eligible would be to establish a grant review committee like the one we have here in Benton County. So the bill was introduced in 2021, and as John was saying, it was a busy year, and we had wildfires and COVID and whatnot, but this bill also did not receive a hearing. But Speaker Rayfield now has said he's thinking about reintroducing it again in 2023. And so our attitudes towards beavers is changing. We know they're not predators that eat fish or rise from the depths to grab unsuspecting swimmers. But beavers can be problematic, and they do provide important benefits to the environment, other wildlife, and people. So unfortunately, beavers are facing many threats right now, including habitat loss and climate change, in addition to direct killing by people. But it's time that we create more programs that encourage people to coexist with beavers and other wildlife, because if we help them, they'll most certainly help us. And if you think Speaker Rayfield's bill is a good idea, it'd be great if you gave him a call or sent him an email and let him know, encourage him to continue his work with that project. Also, if you like the idea of the Benton County grant program for non-lethal deterrence, it'd be great if you let the Benton County commissioners know about that. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Randy. I want to invite the other presenters to just come back on. Maybe let's try a question or two. We're only about 10 minutes past 8. I'll set you up so we're not seeing your screen anymore, Randy. Let's fix that. Oops.
Bonnie just came on mine.
All right. Great. Thanks, everybody. If you are still with us, which we do have some people with us, please do submit your questions, but I do already have a few, so let me dive into them. The first two, I think, are geared towards Jacob. They came after his presentation. And the first one, Jacob, is from Suzanne. She's asking about the pond leveler. Is the discharge point of the pond leveler at the top of the dam, the downstream end of the dam, or a distance downstream?
Yeah, that's a good question. So initially, when I started putting in pond levelers, it was about 6 feet downstream from the crest of the dam. So imagine your dam's crest. And then the photo that Randy showed, you could see kind of the bit of pipe sticking out and the flow moving downstream. I've been working with folks at ODF&W over the last number of years to help disguise the flow that comes down the downstream side of the dam, so it's not attractive to fish, because one concern is that in streams with fish, we don't want them to get confused by the flow moving through the pond leveler and decide to jump into that flow in the pond leveler too. So some of the flow devices we put in, it actually makes a little elbow right on the downstream side of the dam, and then there's a bunch of holes drilled in it, and it kind of feathers out the flow on the downstream side of the dam to try to make that flow less easy for fish to detect. But yeah, all on the downstream side of the crest, and it kind of doesn't matter because you know, beaver are really good about paying attention to any trickling water on the upstream side of their dam, and they totally expect it to be loud and noisy and trickly on the downstream side. So I never have any issues of the beaver plugging the pipe on the downstream side. It's as soon as it's kind of over that crest, it seems to be safe.
Great. Thank you for that. Fran has a question for Jacob. Can Jacob update us on fish passage rules for pond levelers and BDAs?
Yeah, so a little bit on the same lines as the previous question. The concern is that we might confuse fish by putting in a pond leveler. So fish and beaver have been on the landscape together for millennia, right? I wish I had it, but I've seen a bumper sticker that I lust over that says, beaver taught salmon to jump. And that pithy phrase is very accurate. So these two animals have a relationship for a really long time in the landscape. Beaver dams are not a passage problem for adult fish moving up the stream to go lay eggs, and they're not a passage problem from juvenile fish moving back and forth over the course of the time that they're in the stream. The question becomes, if we throw a pond leveler over the top and we artificially keep that dam at a certain level and we focus some flow through the pond leveler, does that change? And we don't actually know the answer to that. But we've been having a conversation with ODFNW fish passage folks for a couple of years now. I think everyone's interested in making sure that we don't cause issues by putting in pond levelers. So an update on where that's at. We're kind of mid-process in, we received a bunch of comments on a set of, hopefully a set of standards for what a pond leveler should look like when installed in Oregon. So the nerdy term for that is best management practices, or BMPs. And we're going to try to publish a set of BMPs by the end of the year that ODFNW feels comfortable with, so that there's a standard of a pond leveler that gets approved for use in the state. And then if there's any grad students or potential grad students listening, this would be a thesis project, would get a lot of citations. We need somebody to study basically how do fish interact with a beaver dam when it's got a pond leveler over the top. No data have been taken on that question yet. So it's just an open, untested hypothesis that it's a problem or not.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Lynn had a question, and I'm not sure who this would go to, so whoever wants to chime in. Will OSU leave the beaver alone on Lamprey along Walnut? Does anybody know?
I'll take an initial crack, I guess.
Sure.
They have to date committed to leave the beaver alone. And as y'all may know, Lamprey Ditch runs, well, I should say Walnut was placed right up next to Lamprey Ditch. So there is some interest in the county as well as maintaining the road integrity. So at some point we may be looking at some pond leveling devices there, but at this point the county has said they're fine with the situation as it is. And we're really hoping that we can, at least for the portion of Lamprey where the beaver really are active, continue to hold that in reserve. It's not impacting any of OSU's operations, and I think that we will continue to find our way forward on that, but I feel hopeful and positive.
That's great. Thanks, Kathleen. And then let's just do one final question, and this is from John. Does Jacob have any info on the Bear Creek oil spill and impacts on beaver?
Yeah, there was that oil spill. I've heard that a number of birds got oiled, and I haven't been directly involved in that. Bear Creek itself, of course, had the Alameda fire as well. So it's taken a couple hits recently. And Bear Creek's a good example of what we were talking about with a stream that's one single channel now, 12 or 15 feet down into the ground. And I think Bear Creek's an interesting example because we've got beaver all along Bear Creek. They live up in the banks, and sometimes they try to get a dam going, but often that gets blown out because the creek is very much a bowling alley. It has a lot of force behind the water because there's very little bends and very few down trees to slow the water down. So you have beaver kind of eking out in existence, but they're not really spreading water out or kind of creating habitat in a broader context. And so we had a fire that ripped through two towns, and the wick that brought that fire through those towns was the Bear Creek Greenway. What would have and could have been a wet area where fire activity would have been really hard to get going. And you'll learn more about that with Emily Fairfax on the next presentation. was instead a highly combustible, very dry riparian area that exploded. And so a lot of beaver got burnt out in that situation. There's a number of bank dens that were burned up. The beaver were out of food for a while, and so they were crossing I-5 trying to get food and getting hit. But the cool thing about wildfire is it's a great reset for beaver. So what happens is you've got all these hardwood trees, and they get killed off on the top, but then they all resprout from the roots. They were trained to do that by thousands of years of beaver, right? These are trees that are along the creeks in our state, and they know to resprout from roots when their top dies. Beaver taught them that. So they start sprouting, and they've got all this juicy stuff. And at the same time, the big tops start falling into that creek where it's been a bowling alley, and beaver haven't been able to make a stand. And suddenly there's a lot of speed bumps in the system, and beaver dams can persist. So the lovely thing about a fire is it's a beautiful reset that beaver can take advantage of. You know, there's caveats, like people feel like they need to clean up all the debris that's falling in the creek. So my hope is for Bear Creek that we can start seeing more beaver activity, and there's a lovely group of volunteers that's planted thousands and thousands of willows along it since the fire for that reason. The oil spill was downstream of that. And like I said, I don't really have any information on the oil spill. I will say though that beaver live in some pretty nasty streams in urban situations. I've been in some water that I feel like I need to fully disinfect after spending any amount of time in, and the beaver seem to be, you know, doing their thing. And through their actions, the water is cleaner. So maybe they live shorter lives, but they seem to be pretty tolerant of some pretty polluted places in our state.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That is amazing. I've learned so much tonight from all of you, and I've gotten a lot of comments from people just thank you for a wonderful presentation. Someone says thank you for so much information from a beaver advocate in northern Minnesota. So lots of people just got a lot out of this, and there were people from I think all over the country here. So thank you all. And we'll say good night. Thank you for those of you who were able to stay this whole time. And we will have a recording of this on our YouTube page. It will be fully captioned when it makes it to the library's YouTube page, but you'll also get a recording to just our kind of raw footage from tonight. It will come to you tomorrow. So thanks again, everyone. And with that, we'll just wave goodbye and see you next time. See you at the next BVALIS event. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you.